Namaste, everyone. Welcome to the Cārvāka podcast. This is your host, Kushalmehra. All right. So, my guest today is Ashwin Sanghi. Ashwin is an best selling author, an award winning author. He's an author of multiple books. But today, we're going to be talking about a very specific book of his latest book, which is called The Magicians of Mazda, which is part of a larger series called the Bharat series. Ashwin, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Kushal, for inviting me. And I must clarify in the beginning that I am a fan of yours.
Thank you, yaar. But matlab, for me personally, I was just telling you offline, today for me is like one of those bucket list things done because, like I told you, एक आप बाकी थे और एक अमीश बाकी है. अभी अमीश को भी लाना बाकी है. बातचीत चालू है
बिल्कुल,
अमीश के साथ
बिल-
कि भैया. So, I have, deep respect for both you and Amish. You guys have done fantastic work in writing, and it's inspirational to see the kind of work you guys produce. I mean, one day I was just sitting and thinking, yeah, you guys write books like people write blogs. That is the speed at which you guys produce content. It's like
but the
mind
problem
blowing.
is that the problem is there is this old proverb which says that writers can write books faster than publishers can write checks. So this is the problem in our lives.
Ashwin, we'll get into the book, but I want to, because this is your first time on the podcast, I actually wanted to dig a little, in your mind. So you are now, so you're a renowned author, but I want to understand because as I was telling you offline, now there are two, three things that fascinated me, especially in this book. Like I always do this when I read a book. I look at the last section first, that has
Mm,
the author given any bibliography, footnotes. Now,
mm.
usually you don't associate this with fiction writing, right? People just
Yes.
write the book and they don't give any footnotes because it's fiction. Why do I need? But lo and behold, you have given copious amounts of footnotes in most of your books, including this book. Now, tell me, how does Ashwin Sanghi sit down and decide, okay, this is how I'm going to structure my book? So can you give us a little sneak peek into your mind in that sense? How do you prepare for a book?
Sure, sure. I think for me, I think a lot of writers, Kushal, they start thinking of ideas when they get down to writing a book. कि भाई वो मैं किस चीज पे लिखूं? That never happens with me because I am a little bit anal about this in terms of capturing ideas as I go along with my life. So I may have this conversation with you, and 2 points raised by you may be very interesting to me. I will email myself, and over the last 10 odd years, I have emailed myself maybe around 10,000 to 12,000 times. It could be an interesting podcast, it could be a YouTube video, it could be a PDF, it could be a web link. I may be traveling along the road and I see something interesting and I take a pic and I email it to myself. So when I need to get down to writing a story, then I go back to my email journal and I look for the ideas that stood out. Once I have figured out that, okay, this is an idea that I can live with for 2 years, because that's the amount of time it takes me to write a Bharat series book. So that's the time when I then start digging into that idea in terms of research, first developing a reading list, and developing also other potential sources of inquiry. For example, the nature of research in different books will be different. The Krishna key involved not only a reading of the Mahabharat, but for example, visiting Dwarka or Somnath or Mathura in order to be able to familiarize myself with a lot of those locations that I was writing about. Or, for example, Chanakya's chant was a reading of the Arthashastra as well as the Mudra Rakshas. If I look at a book like the Sialkot Saga, which covers 70 years of post independence Indian history, then it was actually talking to people who had lived through the 1950s and 60s of Calcutta and Bombay. So the nature of research will change. Keepers of the Kal Chakra, I had to teach myself quantum theory because I wanted to see the overlaps between quantum theory and Buddhism. So the nature of research will change, but typically that research process is 6 months to 9 months. Once I'm done with that, I will sit down in order to develop a plot. because all of these are meant to be thrillers. They are in the thriller genre, and the key element in a thriller is that I must be able to motivate you to turn the page. So what I normally do is I will sit with an Excel spreadsheet, and and this is the old Banya Buddhi probably kicking in, Kushal, which you can relate to. आपने भी सब कुछ छोड़ छाड़ के ये शुरू कर दिया. मैंने वो भी किया 15 साल पहले when I wrote my first book. So the I will sit down and every chapter will be a row on the spreadsheet where I will typically write about 100 or 200 words. What happens in that chapter and what is the hook on which I will end that chapter so that I can propel you into the next chapter. Usme then I will also have another column which refers to the research that is relevant to that particular chapter. This entire process of research and plotting will take me a year. The actual writing of a book will not take me more than 6 months because at that time वो आपने देखा होगा ना जब बच्चे कलरिंग बुक लेके बैठते हैं क्रेयॉन्स के साथ
Mhm.
तो दी
Mhm.
आउटलाइंस आर ऑलरेडी ड्रॉन फिर उसको सिर्फ ये डिसाइड करना है कि मैं यहाँ पर लाल क्रेयॉन काम में लूंगा या ग्रीन क्रेयॉन काम में लूंगा सो द for me the outlines are already drawn and the writing becomes the easiest part of it. So now that takes us into 18 months. The next 3 to 4 months are on the rewrites because I'm a very bad writer and I'm not trying to indicate any false humility out here. I'm genuinely a bad writer, but I'm a fairly good rewriter. So once I go back into the material, I'll say, no, this is working, this is not working. At that point of time, I will lose about 10% or 15% of what I have written. I will discard it. Uh, and that's the most difficult thing to do for any writer because you're in love with every line that you've written. So I will knock out about 10 to 15% of the book at that time. And that then takes me into the next stage, which is in terms of editing, proofreading, and so on and so forth. So that entire end to end process is about 24 months. Now, coming back to the question about the bibliography and the sources at the end of the book. As I've gone along this journey, I will have discovered uh, various sources of information. And every book in the Bharat series is actually that amalgamation of fact and fiction. Uh, Many people call me a mythology writer, some people call me a historical fiction writer, some people call me a conspiracy fiction writer. I don't know what I am, but what I am actually, Kushal, is that I am an overlap guy. Where I see an overlap, a connection, that interests me. So for example, for me, in let's say the Rosabal line, the very first novel I wrote, the notion that there could have been an overlap between a tomb in Srinagar known as Rosa Bal and the life of Jesus Christ, that became my fascination point. So whether it is a overlap between history and mythology, an overlap between science and spirituality, an overlap between philosophy and culture, any overlap is which will be the starting point of a book. But what I want is that once the reader has read the book, and if that subject has interested him enough, then I want them to go on a journey and go dig back into the sources that I had used. So that is the reason why I provide such an exhaustive bibliography of sources, which you normally do not find in fiction novels.
Yeah, honestly, not that I'm a very heavy duty fiction reader for full disclosure, but whenever I've read fiction books, I don't see footnotes and bibliography because that's when I read your work, I was like, hang on, he's giving bibliography. This is very interesting, which takes me to the next bit. Now, fiction is obviously, it's not something that actually happened, but I noticed this, and I don't know if it's by design or it's for any other reason. I'm just curious. Again, I'm trying to understand your writing style is because I have a deep admiration for what you've done and what you've achieved. Now, I see this, you know tone in your writing style where you will use the actual historical event.
Mhm.
That's why there is a bibliography,
Hmm.
and then you take some inspiration out of it, and
Hmm.
that then gets a part in your story where somebody might say, see, this has happened in the
Hmm.
past, So this
Hmm.
had actually happened. Now I'm telling you a story. Is there a actual method behind this, and that is why you work around it, or how is it? How do you come up with that then?
So think about this as a construction project. Okay, in order to create a building, you will first dig a foundation, and then after that you will pour cement and concrete in order to create that foundation. Then after that you will put up the columns and the beams in order to support that entire structure. And then, of course, finally, you will do brickwork and plaster and all of that. So, going back into the novel writing process and my research process, for me, my research, which includes history, theology, philosophy, elements of modern day geopolitics, sometimes a lot of science also, those really are the foundation and the columns and beams. But then, with all subjects, there are always strategic gaps in the narrative. And that is the playground of the fiction author. So, the way I like to think about it is कि मैंने जो research किया है उससे मैंने अपने columns and beams खड़े कर दिए. And then wherever the gaps are, that is where I can then do my brickwork and plastering, which is my fictional narrative. So the idea of any book within the Bharat series is that you should not know when you are reading fact and when you are reading fiction. You should be seamlessly moving between the two. I always like to joke that if I really ask myself what sort of stories do you like, I say, well, I like fact that sounds like fiction, and I like fiction that sounds like fact. So uh, it should be an amalgam. Then, of course, people, the most often asked question is कि अरे अश्विन इसमें fact कितना है और fiction कितना है. And I say, यार, my suggestion, read the disclaimer at the beginning of the book, that you read the entire story as fiction, because we are dealing with subjects that tend to be very personal. They are topics which very often deal with people's faith, with people's own context of religion, or their own narrative. As you know, history is multidimensional, and nowadays, of course, history has also become far more political over the last several decades. Which means, in other words, that there can be multiple narratives and people can choose to live with the narrative that they are more comfortable with. And I don't want to tread on those personal viewpoints of individuals. I say read the whole thing as fiction, but you and I both know that that fiction is based on a better bedrock of research into multiple subjects.
Yeah, you know what fascinates me about fiction writing in that sense is a lot of people don't realize immense philosophy. I mean, my background is philosophy. A lot of serious philosophy has actually come out of fiction, fiction
Absolutely.
writing. Whether
Absolutely.
it's a lot of Russian authors, even Dostoevsky in that matter, and for that matter, people don't realize even George Orwell was like fascinatingly deeply philosophical person,
Absolutely.
and so is it when you write. So I'll give you an example. Like in the book, you have this in the beginning, in the prologue itself, you say Indian gurus have said that true wisdom lies in knowing that one knows nothing. I'm grateful to the universe for having taught me that. I proudly stand before you today as the man who knows nothing, and I raise a toast to my friend Jim Dastur, who is dead. Now, I'm not going to talk about who Jim Dastur is, but my point is that how does one extract deeply philosophical things and insert them? Like most people don't realize that even in the case of Ayn Rand, who came up with a whole school. Now I'm not here to debate whether Ayn Rand's ideas were legit or not, but the point is it was an entirely fictional book, right? That
Yes.
entire book written by Ayn Rand was a fiction, and everybody, basically objectivists, take out all the material out of it, and they build an entire school based on it, which had social values, which had economic values, and it had so many claims. So when you are writing your books, are you expecting people maybe somewhere down the line to do such things from your work, or have you ever, or has that ever happened in your case too?
There are many things. People think that I'm really making an effort to bring a lot of concepts into my story, but very often they don't realize that I'm actually garnering a lot of wisdom as I'm going along. I mean, I really genuinely believe that the process of crafting a novel is my education, because at that time I'm going into the areas that excite me, you know. To give you an example, I mean, in the uh, in 2014 or 15, Dan Brown came to India, and during that annual lecture, his publishers reached out to me and they said he's going to be in conversation in at the NCPA in Bombay. So, Ashwin, will you be in conversation with him, because you are known as the Dan Brown of India? So this will be an interesting sort of thought. So we had a wonderful discussion for an hour, and then after that we went away for dinner, and that dinner did not end for about 4 or 5 hours that night. And after substantial amount of mind lubrication brought on by copious quantities of alcohol, there was Dan asked me, he said, Ashwin, what do you think of God? And I took a pad and a pen, and I wrote on that a formula which I had presented in the Krishna key. It was G is equal to infinity minus K. And so then Dan asked me, he said, now what is this? So I said, well, you consider G is what we consider divine. You can call it anything. You can call it the universe, you can call it Khuda, you can call it Ishwar, you can call it whatever you want. But it is what we consider divine. Infinity is the entire universe, the Brahmand, the entire thing, whether it is now, it is in the future, it is in the past, whether it is in this dimension, in another dimension, everything that has existed or will exist is the Brahmand. So that is infinity. And K is the extent of human knowledge. So in effect, what we don't know, we attribute to God. When the Egyptians saw the sun rise in the east and set in the west, they didn't know what it was. They said, "Arey, this is Ra, the sun god, and he wakes up in the morning and he travels across the sky in his chariot, and at night he gets tired and then he goes to sleep, and that is what causes day and night." Later on, of course, we had Galileo and Copernicus and Aryabhatta and so many others telling us that this is a ball of fire and that the planets revolve around it. And as a result of it, which suddenly the sun lost some of its divine status, because we could now start explaining it. So, in that sense, that was something which came to me as an insight as a part of writing that book. It's not as if I was born with that insight. And very often I go into a second book and I realize, no, what I said in that book was wrong. I need to revise my thought process, because every book will eventually lead you down a certain path. And for me, it has happened more often than not, where I've ended up actually sort of retracing my footsteps and saying, "Arey, no, this is not the right way to think about it." But I think that's part of the enjoyment process, Kushal. But one thing is very clear. For all of my novels, I work on what is called a 70-20-10 rule. And this 70-20-10 rule is related to what I consider to be the three E's of a good book. The
Mhm.
first part of it is entertainment, which must account for 70%, because if I cannot entertain my reader, then I cannot get the reader to turn the page. The most difficult quality of a paperback writer or a mass market writer is to get someone to turn the page. Google did a study several years ago, not Google, but Amazon, from the Kindle, and they found that the average book is read up to page 18. So people buy books, but they don't finish them. So the whole notion that can I get someone to turn the page gives me a sense of satisfaction. It also, in some ways, gives me a certain sense of power that I can compulsively get you to turn the page. So that is one. The next 20% is maybe that by the time you're done reading a Bharat series book, you may feel that I picked up some information that I was not aware of. So, for example, if you were reading, let's say, Magicians of Mazda, about roughly one third of the book deals with Zoroastrian history and the
Yeah.
Sassanids, and it deals with the Achaemenid Empire and Darius and Xerxes, names that you would have heard of, but you may not have put them into a context. So that is the 20% of education that comes along with it. And finally, at the end of the book, what I hope to induce in you is an aha moment that, अरे मैंने ये क्यों नहीं सोचा? He was actually talking about it all along like this. It is that sort of batti on moment. And
Hmm.
that I consider it to be the moment of enlightenment. So if I can entertain you 70% of the time, educate my reader 20% of the time, and by the end of the book, give them 10% of enlightenment, then I think I've pretty much done what I want.
So let's maybe talk about that 20% a little bit over here, and let's talk about the Sassanid history, or just history of the Iranians, and their obviously the Parsi community plays a huge role in this particular book.
Of
There's a
course.
central character which revolves around the experience of the Parsi community. So
Yes.
when you were digging into the history of the movement of the Parsis all the way from Iran
Yes.
right down to India. So, could you tell me maybe three, four instances that really stood out to you, and you were like, "Damn, this happened." I mean, how did this happen to them? Maybe about that.
No, I mean, we all know of Parsi history starting from 720 CE.
Hmm.
720 CE is that year where the first boats arrived with 18,000 refugees uh, at uh, at a place known as Sanjan, which lies in Gujarat. So for all of us, we think that, oh, the Parsis came to us in India around the 8th century. But for me, the really the fascination was that, the Hindu Raja that received them, someone who is referred to as Jadi Rana. Jadi Rana was very comfortable with the Parsis when they arrived. Uh, so to a very great extent, it sort of made me wonder that, was this contact much older? Gujarat lay along the maritime routes which were used by the Zoroastrian sailors from Persia. And in fact, even the Mahabharat uses a term known as Parasika to refer to those people who inhabited regions west of the Indus.
Hmm.
So the thought to my mind was that, isn't it possible that the connection was a much older one? So uh, yeah, over the years, I've been sort of fascinated by the idea that there could be an overlap between Zoroastrian and Vedic elements. So, for example, the Avesta reveres the holy cow, which is a pretty standard accepted notion within Islamic philosophy. Or, for example, Varuna and Mitra are respected even within the Gathas. The Zoroastrian yasnas are very similar to our yagyas. Or, for example, we both have concepts like asura, ahura, deva, deva. We so in that sense, I became more and more convinced that this connection was a far older one than simply the 8th century connection. Uh, and then when I started going deeper and deeper into it, I was suddenly looking at, for example, the main character of Jim. Now, Jim is a derivative of the word Jamshed. Then I started digging into the word Jamshed. And I said, where does the word Jam come from? And Jam actually comes from Yam, and the god of death, as it were. And then, of course, that leads me to another connection, which is Yama and Yamini, the twins. And I was not aware of the fact that Yamini was the source for the star known as Gemini, because it's a twin star. So there are lots of these fascinating sort of nuggets that come along as you are sort of doing your research. uh, we use the term Shehenshah so often because Mughal period, many of the emperors took Shehenshah, and you treat it as an Islamic term. But you very often forget that Shehenshah came from a term which was used by Darius Sheta, Sheta, which is related to Sheta in Sheta, which is the Kshatriya of Kshatriyas. Uh,
Hmm.
Now, you would never imagine that that sort of a connection exists, but it does once we start digging deeper and deeper. So there are a lot of those sort of mind blowing moments that were mind blowing for me when I was doing the research, that which I would have never even thought of, you know. And that's the fun of writing books in the Bharat series, you know. Uh, Take for example the very title of this book, The Magicians of Mazda. Where does the
Hmm.
word magician come from? It comes from the word magi. Where does the word magi come from? Because magi were the ancient priests of the Zoroastrians. And as we know, even during the birth of Jesus Christ, there were three magi who visited him. They were known as the three wise kings, or the three kings of Orient Star. So, why were they called magi? They were called magi because they came from the word uh, magus, magus. The plural is magi, the singular is magus. But where does the word magus come from? The word magus comes from the root magha. In fact, in the Rig Veda, Indra is referred to as Magavan. Anyone who was exalted had great powers, as a result of which these people came to be known as magi. And we use the word magician so casually, not even realizing where that word came to us from. So these are the sort of things where a regular reader of the Bharat series has come to expect that Ashwin is going to start digging deeper and deeper into many of the things. I like to think of my novel very often not as really a linear progression, but almost as an interesting web page with hyperlinks. And you'll go into one hyperlink, and then that hyperlink will lead you into another couple of hyperlinks. It's almost an exploration.
So, there is this particular section in your book. I think it's on Kindle on page 25, where Jim says, but our loyalty must be to humanity as a whole, not vested to interests within the industry. Do I have your unconditional support on this? Now, I'll tell you, we live in interesting times. I'll tell you what this reminded me of. One
Sure.
ancient, which is Vasudeva Kutumbakam, the whole world is my family. Now somebody might come back and say, अरे महोपनिषद में कहा था मगर हितोपदेश और पंचतंत्र में कहा था कि मूर्ख मानता है. So before somebody says, मैं सामने से बोल रहा हूँ, but
सामने से
it
बोल
took
रहे हो.
me, हाँ,
Hmm.
took me first to the Mahopanishad. But then, we are in these COVID times.
Yes.
We are in these times where big pharma has led to multiple things. I'm not an anti-vaxxer. देखो, मैं खुद ट्रिपल वैक्स्ड हूँ भाइयों और बहनों, तो मुझे जज मत करना. मगर what I'm trying to say is we're living in this era of big pharma or big companies and big this and big that, and basically I'm not, see, I can't reveal the plot, but what I'm trying to say is, so when I read this section, right, my brain went into two directions immediately. One was the Vasudeva Kutumbakam ki here's the man trying to say that यार हमारी तो loyalty humanity को होनी चाहिए.
Hmm. Hmm.
and and then the other section replies, हाँ हाँ सही है, I understand your emotion, kind of a thing. So maybe we can talk about this. How does one how does one do this balance in that sense, right? This is a struggle all of us have, whether we do it at our personal level, whether we do it at the level of our society, whether we do it at the level of our country, or whether we do it at the level of humanity, right? And in fact, till the extent that globalist has become a bad word these days. अगर कोई globalist बोलेगा तो भाई भाई दूर हटा है, इससे तो डर
बिल्कुल.
लगता है.
ये
डर
तो
लगता है
पागल है.
मुझे.
ये पागल है. Nowadays, honestly, that has become the refrain.
So, when when you wrote this, did you anticipate somebody coming and telling you, ये क्या पेल रहे हो?
No, I genuinely, in that sense, believe it. You know, philosophically, we are a dharmic we are a dharmic nation, Kushal, and dharmic thought essentially is that the Vasudeva Kutumbakam, and it is essentially plural. It embraces multiple truths. I mean, you can 33 million deities can be part of the same family. Jesus Christ can be incorporated on the facade of a temple, and the Buddha, rather than being an alien to Hinduism, can be absorbed as an avatar of Vishnu. You could be an astic or a nastic. a Shaivite or a Vaishnavite, a vegetarian or a carnivore. You worship the fire like the Zoroastrians, or rather use fire as a means for worship. You could be an idol worshipper or a nature worshipper. You may, Kushal may worship Shiva or Shakti or a combination of both. You may see the path to enlightenment as yantra, tantra, mantra, or none of it. You may hold that the shivling is a stone, and I may say, no, wo patthar jo hai, wo shivling hai. But both of us are welcome. We can have 300 versions of the Ramayana, and your version does not negate mine. And all religions are seen as different parts to the divine. I think that's the great thing about this country that we live in. Uh, and I think that is where there is a fundamental divide between the dharmic and the Abrahamic. And that is something which is rather stark, that, I mean, there is only one true God, and it is my way or the highway. And for the longest time, whether it was the Crusades, or whether it was the invasions, or whether it was the attacks on Somnath, or whether it was the number of incursions that happened, or the holy wars that were fought, they were all related to the fact that the moment you start saying that, listen, my way is the only way, then there
Mhm.
is a problem. And I think gradually the world needs to come to terms with this, that, hey, listen, I mean, if we are really wanting that every, that the idea of Vasudeva Kutumba means that not only do I treat you as my family, but I can't treat you as my family if you don't treat me as your family. So it needs to work all around.
Yeah.
Uh, so I think that broad principle needs to be preserved. That
Yes.
I think that is what I was getting at.
Yeah, so it's about mutual respect, not tolerance, and it's
Not
very
tolerance.
interesting that, in fact, it's around 136 or 137 page where you say the problem with Abrahamic faiths is their eagerness to convince those of other faiths of the error of their ways. My country was only one of the many overrun by fundamentalism. This was an interesting line that is said in the context of, I think, Iran. And the entire experience of the Zoroastrian movement, where one character is speaking. But I want to focus on something else, if you could. Can you talk a little bit about Zoroastrian philosophy? In one of those italicized notes where you start a chapter, you say Zoroastrian philosophy emphasize the value of their own trinity: good thoughts, good words, and good deeds, humata, hukata, and Huvarasta. Can you talk about this a little bit? I loved this. To be very honest, this was such a beautiful thing that you introduced in the book. It was such a profound concept, and it can actually help people a lot.
No, well, I mean, in the sense that, I have spoken a lot about, if you notice, the book is split into two separate portions. One is the present day events that are occurring, which is a typical thriller, where there are abductions, kidnappings, chases, and all of that. That's about two-thirds of the book, and about a third of the book is the first person narration by Jim Dastur. And if you will notice, Kushal, what it starts out by Jim talking about himself and his family, then talking about how his family came to Bombay and how Bombay evolved, then him talking about how the Parsis landed in Sanjan, and as a result of which, eventually there were enough Parsis who could eventually relocate into Bombay. Then he digs deeper into why did they run out of Iran. Then he digs deeper into what was the glorious Zoroastrian empire of the Sassanids, and so on and so forth. He then goes back into the times of Cyrus and Xerxes, uh, but then eventually he digs deeper into the times of Zarathustra, and talks about how did that philosophy evolve. But then when most people think that, okay, now we've reached the origin, that, okay, now he's talked about Zarathustra and how that philosophy came up, uh, then we suddenly dig deeper into the roots of his thought process, that where did that thought process come from. And this is where, to a very great extent, I find the whole concept of the Vedic expanse extremely exciting. I mean, honestly, it still sort of completely, it sends chills down my spine. uh, because we very often forget, I mean, today when we hear about problems happening in Afghanistan, we say, wo wahan par Kandahar mein blast ho gaya. We forget that Kandahar was Gandhar. We forget that Gandhar had Gandhari, who was a major character within the Mahabharata. It's very sometimes we forget about the connections of Kaikai to the Caucasus. We forget about the connections of the river Danube to Danu. Uh, we forget that the word Iran itself is a derivative of the word Aryan. So that entire so-called Aryan crescent, or the Vedic crescent, as it were, I found that very, very fascinating. And the sort of divide between Yama and Manu and the Pitrayana, the Asura Deva divide, and the notion that there was a great war, the Dasranjana, which was fought between the 10 kings, and the so-called schism between the Devas and the Asuras, the rivalry between Bhrigu and Brihaspati, and the emergence of the white-robed Athravan priests, as it were, and then possibly the idea that they were all referring to an original source, which was probably the Atharva Ved, which got somewhere along the way, a division occurred within that. Uh, the entire notion that Ahura Mazda could be a derivative of Asura Maya, or the fact that this was actually nothing else but the final split between Pitrayana and Devayana. That is really what was the exciting bit for me. For me, mythology or spirituality or religion or theology in and of itself is never exciting. For me, people very often, Kushal, ask me that, what do you actually do? Tum karte kya ho? And I said, in the early days, I used to think of myself as a scientist sitting at CERN, the great particle collider at CERN in Geneva. And I'm thinking that I've got two subatomic particles. One subatomic particle is known as myth, and the other subatomic particle is known as history. And I put them into a super collider, and I bring them charging towards one another at a very, very high speed, and they clash together and they fuse into a completely new element. So now neither myth exists nor history exists, but a new element has been created. And that equation is myth plus history is equal to mystery, because it answers that what if question. You and I both know that's a delicious question. What if? Uh, and
Perfect.
that's pretty much what I try to do. And here also, this book is no different. I'm trying to simply dig at what were the roots of this particular philosophy. So could the three great fires have been related to some supernatural events? Could there be a possibility that the trinity of words, thoughts, and deeds could have been related to other trinities? Could there be the possibility that some of the derivatives within Zoroastrianism came as a result, or could both have evolved from a common origin? I explore all of those, and um, it is always my intention to provide you with a certain narrative, but I also, that's one of the reasons why I give you such a comprehensive bibliography, so that you can also explore the alternative narratives. So don't
Got
take me at my word. I mean, the idea is that, if, for example, in this book, I may say, hey, listen, these were ultimately, all of them were related to Atharva. Ultimately, fire was the common point for all of this. There may be others who say, hey, listen, no, I mean, there was some point in the, I mean, you just look at the disagreement on this concept of Aryan invasion, or Aryan migration, or out of India theory. I mean, no one can agree on anything. uh, so the point is that from the context of a fictional story, I have to give you a version, but I don't want you to simply take me at my word. Read all the alternatives also.
And that's how it should be. That's how real exploration. Can I tell you one line in your book that was Actually, there's so many, but I'm going to read this line. Dina would remind the boys that all that money gave a person was the freedom of not having to worry about it. I mean, I don't know if you realize the profundity of this thought, because this is a very profound thought. Because this does not say, those classical things that those uncles in India say, beta paisa to haathon ka mahal hai, beta kya hai? Na 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 na. Sara mahal mujhe de do. This line, and I seriously say this. When I read this line, I was like, how I wish I had I had the skill that Ashwin had. इतना सुंदर तरीके से आपने ये इतनी profound चीज कही है कि money gave us the freedom of not having to worry about it. The point is the amount of worries that are related through money are so high that if you don't
Yeah.
have it,
Yeah.
that's when you get screwed. And
Okay.
वो
So
अंदर का मेरे को लगता है
I
उस
must
moment
tell
में
you.
पुराना businessman आ गया.
Yeah, but I must tell you, first of all, there's a disclaimer there. That particular line was not Ashwin Sanghi's, it was Johnny Carson's line, but it has
Oh
been
wow.
used in the context of that narrative. But nevertheless, it's I agree with you. It's profound because of the fact that when I look back at my own life, Kushal, uh, truly, I grew up in an environment where um, I was born in a business family. It was taken for granted that this is what I'm going to be doing. Um, my The one common element, or the during my growing up years, in Marwadi families, Kushal, and probably in many other business communities, uh, rather than doing a jap in the child's ear, probably the two words that are murmured is debit and credit when the child is born. So Vault of Vishnu. In that, I have narrated a very interesting nugget, an anecdote, which talked about the Silk Road and the merchants of Samarkand. And they had one very interesting tradition. When a baby was born, a boy was born in the house, they would touch a drop of glue to the child's palm, and they would touch a drop of honey to the child's tongue. And the idea was basically that he should have such sweet words that he should be able to sell anything to anyone. And he should have a sticky palm ताकि जो coins हैं वो वहां पर जाके अटक जाए. So the cultural context in which I was born was no different to the merchants of Samarkand. But the one influence I had in my life was my Nanaji, who lived in Kanpur. And I called him Nanaji. He was actually my grand uncle. And he had this habit of sending me one book every week to read. And he would tell me, he would say, बेटा देखो तुम तो बनिया मारवाड़ी फैमिली के हो, लाइफ में तुम तो लक्ष्मी जी को ही पूजोगे. तो बट एक चीज याद रखो कि जो लक्ष्मी और सरस्वती के बीच का जो इक्वेशन है वो बड़ा ही विचित्र है. So I would say, what is it, Nana ji? So he would say, see, Lakshmi is always curious about where Saraswati is. अगर सरस्वती इस कमरे में बैठी है, then Lakshmi wants to come here. If Saraswati gets up and leaves, then Lakshmi also is curious where has she gone, and she leaves to go there. And he said the only deity in our Hindu pantheon of gods who can sit between these two devis and keep them together is Ganesh. So he said, if you want one Sikh from me, live your life like Ganesh. And I like to joke, Kushal, that probably that explains why Ashwin looks the way he does, because he's tried to live his life like Ganesh. But the point I'm making is that that the notion that Saraswati can be a means to Lakshmi is something that I picked up through my Nanaji. But what Nanaji always used to tell me was that remember one thing, that in your life you will realize at a certain point of time that your satisfaction is only coming as a result of that perfect balance of wealth and wisdom. And if one is not in balance with the other, then somewhere along the way, your life as Ganesh will disappear. And now, when I think back at all that has happened in my life and these 15 years, I wrote Rosabal line in 2002 and could not publish it till 2007. So I started writing it in 2002, finished it in 2004 5. and then could not find publisher for 2 odd years before it was eventually published in 2008. But if I look at all of that journey, the what is driving me uh, is certainly not money. Money is that means to be able to live my life normally. It is my ability to be able to enjoy doing what I want to do. I remember a couple of years ago during this COVID pandemic, on 31st evening, I was sitting alone and I was just jotting down some points and I thought about the word happiness. And I said, what is it that drives my happiness? And you know what, Kushal? I made 5 bulleted points on that. And I wrote, number one, health. That if I'm not healthy and the people around me are not healthy, how can I possibly be happy? Because at that moment, happiness jumps out of the window. If a near and dear one has cancer, there's no way that you can be happy in that moment. The second part of it is wealth. That you want that much wealth that you should be able to live your life comfortably. You should be able to once in a while indulge yourself, but it doesn't need to be overbearing. The third, what drives me, is that spirit of creation, that spirit of creativity, that being having an objective to aspire to, because that is what then drives you to the next day. It makes you get up at 4:30 in the morning thinking about the next chapter of your book. The fourth thing is relationships. If you don't have valuable relationships, then you're worth nothing in life. Even if your book is an AC Nielsen bestseller for multiple weeks in a row, who are you going to share it with? There has to be someone who is going to clap for you. Those are the relationships. And finally, I think the fifth is belief in a greater power, that there is something greater than us all. You don't have to be God fearing. People think that, oh, the universe was created as a result of the Big Bang 13 billion years ago. Then the question is, who created the Big Bang? People say, oh, no, 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 actually, the Big Bang was created as a result of a reaction to the Big Crunch. And it was actually a single point of energy, that single point which started expanding into the universe. But who created that single point of energy? So it's one of those Russian dolls where as you peel off a layer, another layer emerges. So I think at least in my life, I have found that money is one part of it. I'm not unreasonable enough to say that "Arey, nahi, nahi, bhul jao yaar, money cannot bring you happiness." It is a part of happiness, but it is not the end all and be all.
One more line, and then I'll start taking the viewers' questions. This is interesting. Yeah, this is the bit where you say when people commented that Baman was smart in spite of limited education, Navroz would retort, "The boy is precisely smart because of his limited education."
Absolutely. And that line actually came to me from my father. That line came to me from my father, not in so many words, but I had just returned from America, having completed a 2 year MBA. And my father turned around and said, "You've spent 2 years learning management theory. Now it's going to take me 2 years to unlearn your management theory for you." So I said, "What is this all about?" He says, "No, you belong to that category which I called Padha Likha Gadha. In other words, you have all the theory at your command, but ultimately he was dad has always been one of those very pragmatic people, and he's the one who has taught me that common sense is not so common, and I was just trying to distill that takeaway from him, that sometimes, at least, if I don't know if you've ever bothered to look back into your alumni lists or into your class lists where you were in high school, and I find surprisingly that the guys and girls who were never very high achievers at school or college, turning out to be incredibly great achievers in later life. And sometimes the ones who were really at the top of the class have fallen to the wayside. What explains that?
Hmm. I don't know. I guess in my case, not that I was great academically. I was not bad, but I was like above average. I was never the class topper or anything of that sense. So in my case, I can probably say, if you ask me, I just think some people are not good in academics, but they eventually find a thing they're good at and they excel in it. And it's all about finding what you're good at
Good at.
eventually.
When I go to these universities, they ask me sometimes. Kids will ask me that, how should I plan my life? And I'd written this book called 13 Steps to Bloody Good Luck. You know, it was a small little non-fiction type self-help book about what is it that makes people lucky, and is luckiness something that comes from the heavens, or is it a trait that you can actually develop? And I would always say to them that, listen, if you are lucky in life, then you get to do what you love. If you are luckier, then you get to do what you love and you are actually good at it. And if you are the luckiest, then you get to do what you love, you're good at it, and someone is willing to pay you for it. Touch wood, I think whether it was you or whether it was me, we both became extremely lucky in that regard, that we were able to do what we love, and we turned out to be fairly good at it, and we eventually ended up finding someone who was willing to pay us for it.
Absolutely. I agree. Now, Ashwin, let's take a few questions because I have a few of them that I need to ask. And I'm really glad that, people are actually asking questions. So I'm proud of the fact that I've cultivated an audience that knows how to ask questions also. So someone has asked, how do you suggest a non-writer get started with serious writing? I have been working on a historical fiction of late, but frustrated with what and how little I wrote. So this, I guess, is an aspiring writer asking one of the most established writers in India. To bataiye jara.
No, I first of all, I don't know where where along the continuum your questioner is at this point of time. But when people ask me how do I get started into writing, I say the first golden rule is write. Many people think about writing, but they don't write. So just cultivate the habit of writing. It could be as little as 100 or 200 words a day. It could be simply writing in your own diary or in a journal, or it could be putting out a very well structured tweet every day, or it could be creating a Facebook post where you really thought about what you are sharing. But get into that habit of writing every day. The second part of it is, I believe that too many people are always worried, log kya kahenge? And this is, this inhibits your writing to a very great extent. There are all With any work of creativity, there is bound to be criticism. It comes with the territory. And the ability to be able to write and then take your fair share of criticism with it. When I wrote the Rosabal line, one of the first reviewers said, I wish he had written a shorter book. Ashwin could have considered stopping on page 10. So the that is the nature of anything creative. Even when people come out of a movie theater, you will find some people going, wow, kaisi picture thi yaar, brilliant. And then there are others who say, I couldn't understand what was going on. So that is it. There is an old joke which says that the relationship between between the author and the critic is the relationship between the lamppost and the dog. So, I mean, the lamppost knows what is going to happen when the dog comes near. So, just stop worrying about what people will say and be free to write. That is the second thing. The third is that always what has worked for me is planning my writing. You heard from me, Kushal, related to the process that goes into the Bharat series. uh, I don't think I would be able to turn out these books if I was not as structured. I know there are friends of mine in the writing world who just say, we take a blank piece of paper and we start writing. It has never worked for me. I am fundamentally one of those people who, even in the world of business, I always wanted a business plan in front of me. I always operated with to do lists and task lists. So, therefore, for me, planning my writing is a very important thing. I would say the fourth thing is, don't lose the day job. It's very difficult to write when you're hungry. And writing is one of those things that you can do at any time. My dear friend Amish used to do it in the car while going back and forth from office to home. I used to do it after coming from a whole day of office, and I would sit at 10 o'clock to write between 10 and 12. And that's how the Rosabal line was written. So you can do that anytime. But if you don't have your stable income coming in, it's very, very difficult to pursue writing as a profession. It will be a long, long time before your royalties will start kicking in. And finally, I would say the fifth thing is that in the event that you do attain a modicum of success, then just remember one thing: remain humble, remain grounded. Remember that every word that came on the page was a blessing from Ma Saraswati. You were only the medium through which those words appeared on the page. Never think of it as your output. It is the output of Ma Saraswati. So remain grounded in that respect. Those are the only things that I can share with aspiring writers.
All right. So now the next question is, this is a very specific question about fiction writing. Have you looked into similarities of Seven Apkallu with Seven Sages of India? Graham Hancock's Magicians of the God, in his book, he goes into similarities of Seven Apkallu with figures in other cultures but not in India. Have you studied this?
Sure. I mean, for example, if you take, let's say, for example, the story of Gilgamesh,
Hmm.
the myth of Gilgamesh, and you take the story of Noah, and then you take the story of Dwarka, you will find many similarities across the flood myths. Or, for example, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, there is the reference to the seven sages. And on the other hand, of course, in India, we have the reference to the Sapta Rishis. And of course, Sapta forms a very important part of everything, whether it's the Sapta Sindhu, whether it's the Sapta Rishi, and so many other concepts. If you read a book of mine known as the Krishna Key, I talk about the fact that it requires seven colors in order to form pure white light, or for example, seven notes of melody, and so many other concepts which are all inextricably linked. uh, the view I have is that a lot of the myths that Graham Hancock explores, I don't even know whether they should be necessarily called myths, because over a period of time, I mean, let's take the greatest myths that we have, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, and of course, people call them mythology. I don't like calling it mythology because it's itihas. In that sense, it is as it happened. But um, if you can have 300 versions of a story, obviously it means that there are different interpretations of what happened. There are different versions of what happened. But does that take away from the fact that something must have happened so that people wrote 300 versions on it? So, my personal view when it comes down to myths is that they are based on some events or some personalities which were so great that people felt that they needed to write about them. I remember, Kushal, many, many years ago, I was at a lecture in Kolkata, and I had half a day free. So I told my driver, I said, मुझे कहीं पर भी ले जाओ. I have 3-4 hours free. He said, साहब आप मंदिर देखेंगे? I said, sure, take me to a mandir. And if you're in Calcutta, then it's assumed for a fact that you're going to a Devi Mandir, Durga Mandir, or something or the other like that. He took me to a road known as Sridhar Roy Road, and on that there was a very unassuming structure, whitewashed structure. I went inside, and in the center of the room, there was a green colored throne, and people were praying. There was a pujari performing puja, and people offering flowers and all of that. And when I looked closely, Kushal, I realized that on that green throne, there was a portrait of Amitabh Bachchan. Uh, and I pinched myself. I've landed up in an Amitabh temple. I was zapped, and I thought that I've come into some different dimension altogether. So I went outside from the mandir. There was a young boy who was selling things like flowers and agarbattis and all. He came with his basket. I was waiting for my car, and I never bought anything from him except for one little book which was known as the Amitabh Chalisa. And that was the moment I realized that no, this is not another dimension. This is an Amitabh temple. People are worshipping Amitabh, and there is even an entire prayer book known as the Amitabh Chalisa. Now, when I was standing there, I thought to myself, I said, supposing Ashwin, your car, the driver loses control of the car and he comes at a high speed charging towards you, he knocks you down, you die on the spot. and you take rebirth in this karmic cycle 1000 years later. And 1000 years later, the cult of Amitabh worship has really caught on. And now there isn't one temple dedicated to Amitabh Bachchan, there are 1 lakh temples dedicated to Amitabh. And someone in that life of yours asks you, do you think Amitabh could have been a real man? Isn't that precisely the question we are asking about our great mythological figures? That could they have been real? The point I'm making is that we layer over the years, layers and layers, so to the point where the original texture of the wall is no longer visible. Multiple layers of paint and plaster have resulted in what we call mythology. But does that take away from the fact that there is an original surface underneath it? No, it doesn't.
Interesting. So, another question. What is Ashwin's way to keep track of subplots and tie up all ends given the complexity of ideas? Any special reason for alliterations in the title?
Actually, I must tell you, if the first book in the Bharat series, the Rosabal line, had no alliterations. It was the Rosabal line. But the second book in the series was, which was Chanakya's Chant, uh, was actually, technically speaking, my first bestseller, because it went on to the Nielsen number one very, very quickly. And that is the reason why, somehow or the other, after the success of Chanakya's Chant, I never thought about changing that structure. So all the subsequent books became alliterations. Can you just excuse me for a minute, Kushal? I just need to plug into power. Give me just
No
a minute.
problem. No problem. No problem. No problem at all. No worries at all. All right. In the meantime, when Ashwin plugs his laptop back in power and he's back, no
Okay.
worries at all.
Yeah. Yeah, so that is as far as the alliterations bit is concerned. As far as the research and keeping track of plots and subplots are concerned, as I mentioned, I use Excel to first plot out everything. Then, once I'm done with the Excel spreadsheet, I use a software known as Scrivener. Scrivener is basically, I mean, I would say it's the ultimate tool for a writer, because what you can do is you can take all the plot points from your spreadsheet, and you can actually make index cards, so that you can then move around those index cards in terms of, well, I mean, like when I was working on my crime thrillers with James Patterson, he would say, I love the flow of this chapter where this murder happens, but I wish it was happening earlier. So then you want to move that entire event, but it's going to change certain things in the rest of the story. So Scrivener helps you do that, and then attached to every index card is the actual essay. When I'm writing, let's say, a novel of 150 words, I don't think of it as a or a or a novel of 150 chapters. I don't think of it as a novel of 120,000 words. I think of it as 120 short stories. So what I'm doing is basically writing 120 short stories, which are all linked to one another and which I
Hmm.
can move around at will, but knowing fully well that it's dynamic. So if I've moved one thing, it's going to have implications somewhere else. You know.
Got it.
Uh,
Got.
so, but Scrivener is very useful, and then from Scrivener, I export everything into the other advantage of Scrivener is that all my relevant research, I can actually bring it into Scrivener. So I can import PDF files, I can import web links. So even if I'm on a flight and I need to access a web page, I can access it online via Scrivener. So all of that becomes much easier. And then, of course, once I'm done with the entire story, our present day editors are not at all comfortable in terms of using Scrivener. So then export the
Mhm.
whole thing into Word and then let the editors take over.
All right. So I'm going to mix these two questions together because they're all about writing. It's good. A lot of aspiring writers and are asking questions, I guess. So does writing Indic fiction using Hindu philosophy or theology uh, get any pushback from publishers because of the way the world is structured? And the second one is, how the hell does one find a good publisher in the first place? Because also, is ghostwriting a serious problem in your field?
Uh, well, I don't think ghostwriting is a serious problem. Poor writing is a serious problem. But I've not come across too many people who are doing ghostwriting or getting their stuff ghost written. And it's very evident from the output that emerges that if it was a ghostwriter, it would probably sound a lot better. But I would say that there is uh, the overall industry is yet to the publishing industry, as it were, remained in the dark ages in India for a long, long time, Kushal, because
Yeah.
um, particularly when you talk about the world of English fiction, uh, most of the publishers in our country have their are parts of multinational conglomerates, and for the longest time their interest was really in pushing their best-selling titles from the west in India. So as a result of which, I mean, if you remember, I remember in my growing up years, I would walk into a bookshop and I would be only looking at Jeffrey Archer or Robert Ludlum or Frederick Forsyth or
Exactly.
what have you. And I think for the longest time, it was believed that, well, Indian writers should be focusing on either writing award-winning stuff. So you're a Salman Rushdie or an Arundhati Roy or an Amitav Ghosh. Not that I have anything against anyone who's writing award-winning literary fiction, but that is what you were meant to be focused on. Or
Hmm.
alternatively, you were writing family sagas or epics, or you were writing how to make a great biryani. Those were the things which Indians were supposed to do. Uh, Now, what is very surprising is that you already had fiction writers in Hindi who were selling in lakhs. You had people like Surendra Mohan Pathak selling at every railway station in the thousands. But somehow or the other, that could not be replicated in the world of English fiction. And for that, if we owe a real debt of gratitude, it is probably to Chetan Bhagat. Because had it not been for the arrival of Chetan, I don't
Hmm.
think that that paradigm would have changed. Where suddenly a publisher said, well, if Chetan Bhagat can sell a few lakh copies, then that means, in other words, there's something that we've missed. And then, of course, Amish came onto the scene, and various others came onto the scene, as a result of which suddenly this took off. Uh, does it mean that it is only Indic mythological stuff which is relevant? No, I don't think so. I think there are going to be many more genres that are going to explode. So, for example, I think crime thrillers. If you look at all the Western bookshops, the top tens are always crime thrillers, but that doesn't happen yet in India. It will eventually happen. Or, for example, you take, for example, sci-fi, or you take, for example, horror and paranormal. There are many subgenres within the world of fiction which have not yet been fully explored. And even if they have been explored, they've remained niche books which have sort of just sold a few thousand copies and then sort of poof disappeared into the market. I think that has to become far more stable, and we need to have far more authors thinking out of the box. If if I had thought about only doing what Chetan was doing, I would not have written the Rosabal line. People thought I was mad when I was trying to write a theological thriller based on the life of Jesus Christ. I mean, they said, "Are you nuts?" So I think
Hmm.
this is very important, that all aspiring writers should be trying to push the boundaries. And the publishing industry is today a different place than what it was 15, 20 years ago. They are far more open to new ideas.
That's good to hear, because I have no experience of this side of the aisle. I can only guess what it must be like, because there are a lot of times they are you know mm, there are these preconceived notions about publishing in India and what publishers want and what publishers seek. So it's actually, in a way, it's good that you are sharing this perspective, and it inspires more people to write. And what people don't realize, I guess, maybe in the non-fiction genre, publishers might be more rigid, and in the fiction genre, I think there is more flexibility. I don't know. I'm not sure, what the exact play there might be, but that's what I'm assuming. But because the one good thing about hosting a podcast is you get to speak with so many authors,
Yes.
and I have had the pleasure to speak with non-fiction and fiction writers both, and I do tend to see that when it comes to the non-fiction writers, they tend to have a lot more pressure especially if they don't toe a certain line
Yeah.
in that sense.
Yeah. I think the good news is that today the bestseller lists are dominated by Indian writers. Part one. Part two, what is also good news is that it isn't only mythology that is selling. There is other stuff that is, like, for example, you've just read The Magicians of Mazda. There's there's very little mythology in it.
Yeah.
It's a lot of historical narrative along with the thriller element. So I
Mhm.
think as we are going along, more and more newer ideas are being allowed to flourish. And over a period of time, what we are going to see is that there will be an, I mean, you take, for example, Kushal, the sudden spurt in biographies. You see, for example, or also alternative narratives. I mean, you take someone like, for example, a J. Deepak, or you take someone like a Vikram Sampath. You would not imagine that these books would ever be able to break that ceiling which had been set
Absolutely.
by a lot of the publishers, that, hey, listen, these will not cross beyond this number. So
Mhm.
a lot of things are very dynamically changing. And that's the reason for whoever it is who has asked this question, I'm very keen that aspiring writers must really think, and don't get carried away by herd mentality and say, oh, no, either it is chicklet or it is campus romance, because campus romance worked with Chetan Bhagat, or mythology worked along with Amish, or it is fundamentally thrillers that worked along with Ashwin. No, there are many spaces that you can explore.
Fascinating. And you know what? I hope what the the one thing that if young kids who watch this podcast over on YouTube or listen to this um on Spotify is that if they aspire to write, I think whether it's you, whether it's Amish, and many others, the one thing they can learn is but through listening to you guys, and you guys have been such great achievers in this field, and you guys have given so much to the art of writing that like I'm a pathetic writer. I've always sometimes I kind of wonder how do you guys do it, and it's so nice, like when I was, which is why when I was reading your book, I was taking out these excerpts and these beautiful lines that were part of the book, because you know the written word has its own impact, the spoken word has its own impact, and that's the beauty. I mean, sometimes, yeah, I can say I have a hold over the spoken word, I can speak, but yeah, I somehow when it if I'm told to transfer that to writing, I just can't do it.
Mm.
And maybe it is all about practice too, but it's an absolute pleasure to see how you do it, or Amish does it, and many more does it, Vikram Sampath does it. I mean, the way Vikram wrote the Savarkar biographies, people don't realize
Absolutely.
how effortlessly he wrote those 1200 pages of which could have been bland in that
Absolutely.
sense, but it was not.
Absolutely.
So hats off to all of you guys. And Ashwin, I can only say one thing before we wrap today's discussion up. People like you inspire people like me, and you guys are amazing, and you are amazing, and I wish you all the best. And thank you very much for coming on this on my podcast and having a chat with me.
Kushal, let me tell you, first of all, it was my pleasure to be chatting with you, because I know the amount of homework that you do before you do each one of these
Thank you.
podcasts. And I've been for dime a dozen interviews where people simply say, oh, what is your writing process? Or, do you use a typewriter, or do you use a pen and paper? And I know that this person has done zero homework before. They've probably not even read the book. That's expecting too much. Whereas I know for a fact that probably you would have read the book twice before you eventually frame your questions. So thank you for doing that level of homework. Thank you for inviting me here. It is not only a pleasure, but it's my honor to be here with you, Kushal. And in some ways, we are birds of a feather, because we both gave up very different lives in order to do what we do. So that also somehow makes me feel connected to you. So thank you. It has been an absolute pleasure to be in conversation with you.
Thank you very much. It means a lot to me coming from someone who I've actually admired. So not only am I, it's like for me in many ways it's a fanboy moment, and I appreciate your words, and I look forward to having many more conversations with you. But before we wrap today's chat up, guys, again in the description of the podcast, I've left a link where you can go and buy the book. So I've basically hyperlinked Ashwin's book website, and you can go and buy it on Flipkart, Amazon, wherever. There are multiple links over there. You can go and buy it. I insist all of you go and buy the book. I mean, if you're a hard copy guy, you can buy it there. I'm personally a Kindle person. I read books on Kindle, so you can go because the book is available on Kindle too, and you can buy the entire Bharat series. And as far as I'm concerned, look, I try my best to talk to multiple authors, discuss subjects which are not being spoken about, or not a popular hashtag on social media. So this podcast only survives by crowd support. I do not take sponsorships. I do not take anything. Is because I want complete intellectual control on this platform. I do not want to, and I want to make this platform majorly about books. As you see, I've done more than 60 book reviews on this podcast. There's nobody doing that out there. I only do it. I may work hard. I read the book and I try to do it because I appreciate the hard work that an author does. When you put your blood and sweat for like a year and a half, 2 years, and then you churn out a book, the least I can do as a podcaster is first read it. And I know many people out there don't read books. So please don't be like that person. And for me to go on doing this, I need your support. So please subscribe to the channel, like this video. You can become a member on YouTube or on Patreon. You can buy the merch, or you can send your donations directly through UPI. I will see you guys next time. Until then, namaste. Take care. Bye bye.